The plasma restraints burned against Dr. Kayla Voss's wrists as the hegemony guards dragged her through the corridors of Detention Complex Omega-7. Her medical bag had been torn from her shoulders 3 days ago, its contents scattered across the blood-soaked battlefield where she'd been treating wounded soldiers from both sides of the Rim Wars. That had been her crime-healing enemy combatants alongside her own people. Disgusting human sympathizer, Spat Guard Prime HFY, his chitinous mandibles clicking with disdain. The towering Kitharin's 6 eyes focused on her with predatory intensity. "You'll learn what happens to those who show mercy to our enemies." Kayla said nothing. Her dark hair hung in matted tangles around her face, but her green eyes remained defiant. She'd taken the Hippocratic Oath 20 years ago, fresh out of medical school on New Geneva. That oath didn't specify species, it said do no harm. And in her mind, allowing preventable deaths was the greatest harm of all. The detention complex stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of reinforced steel and energy barriers. Through the translucent walls, she caught glimpses of other prisoners, humans, yes, but also Kitharins, Velter, and species she didn't recognize, all enemies of the hegemony, all deemed worthy of punishment rather than prisoner of war status. They passed through 3 security checkpoints, each scanner reading the quantum signature embedded in her restraints. At the final checkpoint, a massive Velter warrior hung suspended in a containment field, his blue-scaled body covered in untreated wounds that wept crimson. His breathing was labored, chest rising and falling in erratic patterns that Kayla recognized. Immediately punctured lung, possibly ruptured spleen. "Please," she called out to the guards, "that prisoner needs medical attention. He's dying." HFY's laugh was like grinding metal, exactly as intended, soft skin. "The Velter chose to resist our righteous expansion. Death is their reward." Kayla memorized the location, the guard rotation, the security measures. Her medical training had taught her to observe, to analyze, to find solutions where others saw only problems. The hegemony might have captured her body, but they'd made a critical error. They'd placed a human doctor in a facility full of suffering. Beings. Her cell was a cube of energy barriers, 6 meters on each side, containing only a waste receptacle and a wall-mounted nutrient dispenser. But it wasn't empty. Across the narrow corridor, she could see dozens of other cells, each containing prisoners in various states of injury and despair. The cell to her immediate left held a young Kitharin, female, her carapace cracked and leaking hemolymph. To her right, a human soldier from the 15th Colonial Marines sat cradled against the wall, his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. The stench of infection was noticeable even through the energy barriers. "What's your name?" Kayla asked the human soldier. He looked up with fever-bright eyes. "Private Marcus Dwight, ma'am, 15th Marines, Bravo Company." His voice was weak, but there was still military precision in his response. "I'm Dr. Kayla Voss." "How long has that leg been broken?" 6 days, ma'am. They don't provide medical care to prisoners." Kayla's hands clenched into fists. 6 days with a compound fracture. No treatment, no pain relief. The infection would be systemic by now, spreading through his bloodstream. Without intervention, he'd be dead within 48 hours. She surveyed the other visible prisoners, cataloging their injuries with a trained eye. The Kitharin females showed signs of severe dehydration. Their species required specialized electrolyte solutions every 12 hours, or they'd enter metabolic shutdown. A group of Velter warriors in the far cells bore the characteristic purple bruising of hegemony shock staves, indicating internal organ damage. The guards had made their second critical error. They'd assumed that imprisoning a human medic would break her spirit, would force her to watch helplessly as beings died around her. They didn't understand human nature. They didn't understand that humans were at their most dangerous when their moral convictions were challenged. As the artificial night cycle dimmed the detention block's lighting, Kayla began to plan. The nutrient dispensers were connected to the facility's main power grid. The energy barriers were linked to a central control system. And somewhere in this complex was a medical bay. Every detention facility had one, even if it was reserved for guards. She'd taken an oath to heal, to preserve life, to do no harm. The hegemony had captured her thinking they were imprisoning a helpless healer. They were about to discover they'd caged something far more dangerous, a human with nothing left to lose and every reason to fight. The revolution would begin with a single act of healing. It would end with the hegemony learning why humanity had earned its reputation across the galaxy as the species that simply refused to surrender. The opportunity came during the third night, when Guard Prime Kefir made his rounds with only a single subordinate. Kala had been feigning sleep, watching the guard's patterns through half-closed eyes. She'd noticed that Kefir always paused at the Velter warrior's cell, savoring the sight of his suffering. "Please," she called out as they approached, injecting desperation into her voice. "My stomach. Something's wrong with the nutrient paste. I think I'm having an allergic reaction." Kefir's mandibles clicked with amusement. "Human weakness. Your species is pathetically fragile. I need medical attention," Kayla gasped, clutching her abdomen and doubling over. "The Geneva Conventions don't exist here," Kefir finished, but he was curious enough to lower the energy barrier and step into her cell, keeping his plasma rifle trained on her. "Show me these symptoms." Kayla had learned hand-to-hand combat during her residency in the outer colonies, where pirates and raiders were constant threats. The moment Kefir leaned closer to examine her, she struck. Her elbow connected with the junction where his chitinous neck met his thorax pressure point. She'd memorized from xenobiology texts. The massive Kitharin dropped like a falling tree, his nervous system momentarily paralyzed. His subordinate reached for his weapon, but Kayla had already snatched Kefir's rifle. The plasma bolt caught the second guard's center mass, and he collapsed in a smoking heap. "Marcus," she hissed to the human soldier. "Can you move, Mom?" "Yes, ma'am," he whispered back, dragging himself toward the barrier controls that Kefir had been wearing on his utility belt. Within minutes, Kayla had accessed the detention block's control system. The energy barriers flickered and died throughout the entire section. Dozens of prisoners stumbled from their cells, blinking in confusion and fear. "Listen to me," Kayla called out, standing atop an overturned bench. "I'm Dr. Kayla Voss, human, Colonial Medical Corps. You're all going to die in here if we don't act, but I need your help first." The Velter warrior she'd seen dying earlier collapsed at her feet, his breathing almost non-existent. Without hesitation, Kayla knelt beside him, her hands finding the pulse point she'd memorized from alien anatomy studies. His name was Kevdon, and he'd been a ship's gunner before his capture, using strips torn from the guards' uniforms. She fashioned pressure bandages and tourniquets. The nutrient dispensers could be cracked open to reveal their internal power. Cells crude, but effective defibrillators when properly modified. She worked with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "You." She pointed to a group of Kitharin prisoners. "Hold him steady. His lung is punctured. I need to create a chest seal." To the humans she called out, "Start gathering anything that can be used as medical supplies. Food containers, fabric, power cells, everything." Private Dwight had managed to rig a crude splint for his leg using debris from the destroyed. "Security. Station. Doc, we've got maybe 10 minutes before reinforcements arrive. The whole complex is going on alert." "Then we work faster," Kayla replied, sliding her hands along Kevdon's ribcage until she found the break. "I need something sharp and sterile. Anyone have ideas?" A Kitharin female, the same one Kayla had noticed dying of dehydration, held up a jagged piece of the energy barrier's housing. This was superheated when the barriers failed. "Should be sterile." Kayla nodded grimly. Field surgery with improvised tools. She'd done it before in the outer colonies. She made the incision between Kevdon's ribs, releasing the pressure that was crushing his lung. The Velter warrior's breathing immediately improved and his eyes fluttered open. "Why?" he whispered in accented standard. "Why help enemy?" "Because you're not my enemy," Kayla replied, sealing the while with medical tape salvaged from the guards' first aid kits. "You're a patient." As she worked, the other prisoners began to organize. The humans, trained soldiers, all took defensive positions. The Kitharins, natural engineers, began sabotaging the complex's systems. The Velter warriors, despite their injuries, prepared for combat with whatever weapons they could improvise. But it was what happened next that would define the revolution. A young Kitharin male approached Kala as she finished treating Kevdon. His carapace bore the scars of plasma burns, and his primary arms had been deliberately broken by interrogators. "I am Dekmer," he said formally. "I was combat medic for Kitharin Defense Force." "Will you teach me human medicine?" Kayla looked up from her patient, seeing something in the young alien's compound eyes that she recognized, the same desperate need to heal that had driven her to medicine in the first place. "First lesson," she said, handing him the improvised scalpel. "The Hippocratic Oath doesn't recognize species barriers. Do you understand?" Degmer's mandibles clicked what she was learning to recognize as determination. I understand. Doctor Teacher, the sound of marching feet echoed from the main corridor. Reinforcements were coming, but as Kayla looked around at the prisoners she'd freed, she saw something the hegemony hadn't counted on. Humans, Kitharans, and Velter working together. United by shared suffering and a common enemy, the revolt had begun with healing. Now it would continue with war. The emergency klaxon screamed through detention complex Omega-7 as Kayla led her improvised medical team through the maze of corridors. In the 3 hours since the initial breakout, their numbers had grown from 37 freed prisoners to over 100. Each liberated section revealed more horror torture chambers masquerading as interrogation rooms, starvation cells, where prisoners had been left to die, medical experimentation labs where hegemony scientists tested biological weapons on living subjects. Seal that blast door, Kayla shouted to a group of Kitharan engineers who were welding sheets of durasteel across the main access corridor. Plasma bolts hammered against the other side, each impact shaking the entire facility. She knelt beside a Velter female they'd just rescued from the experimentation wing. The woman's scales had been partially dissolved by acid, revealing raw muscle beneath. Her name was Sithara, as she'd been a teacher before the war, a fact that made Kayla's hands shake with rage. As she cleaned the wounds, Dr. Deckmer called from across the improvised medical bay they'd established in the facility's main cafeteria. The human prisoner from Block C is losing too much blood. The plasma burns are too extensive. Kayla looked up from Sithara to see Colonel Rita Blackstone, former commander of the 3rd Colonial Defense Regiment, lying on a makeshift surgical table. The woman's entire left side had been seared by a plasma cutter during enhanced interrogation. Her pulse was thready, breathing shallow. Start a blood transfusion, Kayla ordered. Use my blood, human universal donor, and give me every painkiller we can find in the guard's medical supplies. Doc, Private Dwight called from his position at the security monitors. We've got bigger problems. They're bringing in the heavy units hegemony shock troops with power armor. Our improvised weapons won't scratch them. Kayla continued working on Colonel Blackstone while her mind raced. The hegemony had obviously decided that containing the revolt was no longer an option. They were switching to extermination protocols. Every prisoner in the complex would be killed rather than risk the embarrassment of a successful uprising. How many functional fighters do we have? She asked while suturing plasma burn tissue. Kevdon, the Velter warrior she'd saved in the initial breakout, answered from his position coordinating the defense. 47 humans, 30 Kitharans, 28 Velter. But most are wounded, and our weapons are limited to what we've salvaged from guards, the medical supplies. Kayla said suddenly, her hands never pausing in their work. Deckmer, bring me everything from the pharmaceutical storage, everything. The young Kitharan medic scuttled away, returning minutes later with armloads of medical containers. Kayla's eyes scanned the labels: anesthetics, stimulants, antibiotics, and synthetic compounds she didn't recognize. But there, in a container, marked with hegemony biohazard warnings, was something that made her smile grimly. Velter metabolic boosters, she murmured, holding up a vial of crimson liquid, designed to accelerate healing in wounded prisoners for extended interrogation sessions. Kevdon's eyes widened in understanding. In combat doses, those would turn your people into living weapons, Kayla finished. Enhanced strength, accelerated reflexes, pain immunity. The side effects would be severe, but we're dead anyway. Sithara croaked from her medical bed. Despite her injuries, the teacher's eyes were sharp with intelligence. Doctor, you're asking us to chemically enhance ourselves for battle. This violates everything your human medical ethics teach. Kayla's hands stilled on Colonel Blackstone's wounds. The woman was right. Everything she'd been taught, every principle of medical ethics, screamed against using drugs to enhance combat capability. But as she looked around the cafeteria turned hospital, seeing beings who'd been tortured and experimented on, she felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. My oath says do no harm, she said quietly, but sometimes the greatest harm comes from inaction. The explosion that rocked the complex interrupted any further debate. The blast doors they'd sealed were buckling under concentrated plasma cannon fire. Through the security monitors, they could see hegemony shock troops in full battle armor advancing methodically through the corridors, killing any prisoner they encountered. Decision time. Kevdon growled, enhanced combat stims or we die as we are. Colonel Blackstone, barely conscious on the surgical table, grabbed Kayla's wrist with surprising strength. "Doc," she whispered, "those bastards tortured my people for information about human military tactics. They're going to execute every prisoner when they breach our position." Her grip tightened. Sometimes a medic's job is to make sure her patients live long enough to fight another day. Kayla looked around at the faces watching her human. Kitharin and Velter, all united in desperate hope. She'd spent her entire career healing, preserving life, following the sacred principles of medicine. Now, to save these lives, she was about to violate everything she'd been taught. "Degmer," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Prepare combat doses of the metabolic boosters for all Velter fighters. Mix the human adrenaline compounds with the Kitharin nerve accelerants. I want every species enhanced to their biological limits." As the young medic began preparing the injections, Calla continued her work on Colonel Blackstone, outside their barricaded position. The sounds of battle grew closer. The hegemony was coming to finish what they'd started: the systematic execution of every prisoner in the complex. They'd made a critical mistake, though. They pushed a human medic past her breaking point, and they were about to discover that, when humans abandoned their principles in service of a greater good, they became something far more dangerous than any weapon in their arsenal. The revolution was about to become a war. The first wave of hegemony shock troops breached the sealed blast doors with shaped plasma charges that turned dursteel into molten slag. Through the smoking gap came 10 soldiers in powered armor, their weapons systems immediately acquiring targets among the defending prisoners. What they found waiting for them was nothing they'd trained for. Kevdon moved like liquid death, the Velter metabolic boosters turning his already formidable warrior instincts into something transcendent. His improvised spear, a sharpened piece of structural support, punched through the first trooper's armor like it was paper. The enhanced strength allowed him to lift the 800-kilogram soldier overhead and hurl him into his squad mates. Like a projectile, the Kitharin fighters, their nervous systems accelerated by the chemical cocktails Kayla had prepared, moved with spider-quick precision. Their natural ability to climb walls and ceilings became a tactical nightmare for the hegemony troops, who found themselves under attack from every angle simultaneously. But it was the human soldiers who provided the tactical brilliance that turned enhancement into victory. Overlapping fields of fire, Colonel Blackstone shouted, her voice carrying despite the fresh bandages wrapped around her torso. She'd refused additional painkillers, needing her mind sharp for command. Kitharins, sealing positions. Velter, close assault. Humans, provide covering fire and tactical coordination. The battle in the cafeteria became a meat grinder. Hegemony weapons designed to suppress lightly armed prisoners proved inadequate against enhanced alien physiology and human tactical doctrine. Private Dwight, his legs still splinted but his aim unimpaired, picked off targeting sensors on the powered armor with salvaged plasma rifles. The temporary blindness allowed the enhanced Velter warriors to close distance and engage in melee combat where their chemical enhancements provided overwhelming advantage. Kayla worked frantically in the center of the chaos, her medical station becoming a casualty collection point. The enhancements came with a price. Velter warriors were suffering cardiac stress. Kitharin nervous systems were beginning to overload, and the human adrenaline boosters were causing dangerous blood pressure spikes. Degmer, she called to her assistant while injecting a cardiac stabilizer into a convulsing Velter fighter. Start preparing. Crash drugs were going to have mass cardiac events when the stimulants wear off. A plasma bolt seared past her head, close enough to singe her hair. She looked up to see a hegemony trooper advancing through the smoke, his armor crackling with energy shields. Before she could move, Sethara, the teacher, who'd been dissolved with acid, launched herself from a medical bed directly into the soldier's path. The Velter female had injected herself with combat stims despite her horrific injuries. She struck the trooper with enough force to crack his helmet, her claws finding gaps in his armor. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and spurting hemolymph. Medical emergency, Kayla shouted, abandoning her current patient to reach Sethara. The teacher was dying, her enhanced metabolism finally overwhelmed by her injuries. But she'd saved Kayla's life in the process. Did I do well? Sethara whispered, her hand finding Kayla's. You did perfectly, Kayla replied, injecting the strongest painkiller she had available. Your students would be proud. As Sethara's eyes closed for the final time, something fundamental shifted in Kayla's understanding of her role. She'd become a doctor to preserve life. But in this hellscape, Sometimes preserving life meant teaching others how to take it effectively. The first wave of shock troops was dead or dying, but the victory came at a cost. 12 prisoners had been killed, and another 20 were suffering various levels of chemical poisoning from the enhancement drugs. Worse, the facility's main power was failing under the strain of the battle damage. Doc, Colonel Blackstow, Nee, called from her command position, "We've got maybe 10 minutes before the next wave hits. They're bringing heavier weapons plasma artillery that'll level this entire section." Kayla surveyed the carnage around her improvised medical station. Bodies of friends and enemies lay intermingled, the air thick with smoke and the metallic scent of blood. Her hands were stained red human red, blue Velter hemolymph, clear Kithra and vital fluids. "That we don't wait for them to come to us," she said, surprising herself with the coldness in her voice. "Degmer, how much enhancement drugs do we have left?" "Enough for one more mass dose, Dr. Teacher, but the casualties will be 100% if we stay here." Kayla finished. She looked around at the surviving Fighter 63, beings from 3 different species, united by shared suffering and a desperate need for survival. "Colonel, what's the most heavily defended area of this complex?" Blackstone's smile was sharp as a blade. "The command center, central hub for the entire facility. Maximum security, probably where they're coordinating the extermination protocols." "Then, that's where we're going," Kayla decided. "We take the command center. We can broadcast what's happening here to the outside galaxy, make the hegemony's crimes public." Kevdon, his scales still flushed with combat stems, nodded grimly. "A final assault, warriors' deaths, if nothing else." "No," Kayla said firmly. "Not warriors' deaths. Victory. Because I didn't violate every principle I've ever held sacred just to die in this place." She picked up a plasma rifle from a fallen guard, checking its charge level with practiced efficiency. "I patched you all up, enhanced you beyond normal limits, and watched you fight like demons. Now, I'm going to do something that should terrify the hegemony more than any weapon." "What's that, Doc?" Private Dwight asked. Kayla's smile was cold as vacuum. "I'm going to stop being a healer and start being human." The revolution was about to become a crusade. The assault on the command center began with Kayla's medical knowledge turned weaponized. Using her understanding of hegemony physiology gained from treating torture victims, she had synthesized aerosol compounds that would specifically target their respiratory systems. The chemical weapons, deployed through the complex's ventilation system, weren't lethal, but they left the guards incapacitated and helpless. "Remember," she called to her enhanced fighters as they prepared for the final push. "We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. Every prisoner who dies here today does so because the galaxy allowed the hegemony to commit these atrocities in shadow. We make this public, we make it loud, and we make sure it never happens again." The command center occupied the entire top level of detention complex Omega 7, a circular chamber lined with tactical displays and communication arrays. To reach it, they had to fight through 7 levels of increasingly desperate hegemony. Resistance, level 1 fell quickly. The guards, already weakened by Kayla's chemical attack, offered minimal resistance to the enhanced prisoner assault. Kevdon led the Velter warriors in a thunderous charge up the main stairwell, while Kithra and fighters swarmed through ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels, leveled to cost them blood. Hegemony reinforcements had arrived from other sections of the complex, fresh troops with sealed environmental suits that protected them from the chemical weapons. The fighting evolved into brutal close-quarters combat in narrow corridors designed for security, not warfare. THEK single quotes more. The young Kithran medic turned warrior took a plasma bolt through his primary thorax while treating a wounded human soldier. Kayla reached him seconds too late, watching the light fade from his compound eyes as hemolymph pulled beneath his broken carapace. "Dr. Teacher," he whispered with his last breath. "Did I honor the oath?" "You honored everything," Kayla replied, closing his eyes gently. But the grief would have to wait. The battle was far from over. Level 3 through 5 became a nightmare of sustained combat. The hegemony had activated their emergency protocols, flooding the stairwells with automated defense systems, plasma, turrets, energy barriers, and gravitic mines turned every step forward into a potential death sentence. Colonel Blackstone, despite her injuries, proved why she commanded a full regiment. Her tactical brilliance turned the prisoners' desperate assault into coordinated military operations. Kitharans take the left flank through the maintenance shafts. Velter straight up the center. Your enhanced strength can punch through their barriers. Humans provide overwatch and technical support. The casualties mounted with each level gained. Velter warriors, their enhanced metabolisms finally failing, collapsed from cardiac arrest even as they achieved impossible feats of strength. Kitharan fighters, their nervous systems burned out by chemical acceleration, fell into seizures that no medical intervention could prevent. By level 6, Kayla's medical supplies were exhausted. She'd moved beyond triage to battlefield amputations, using plasma cutters to remove destroyed limbs rather than let prisoners bleed out. Her hands, once dedicated solely to healing, now wielded weapons with deadly efficiency when medical crises demanded immediate security. "Doc," Private Dwight gasped, his splinted leg finally giving out completely. "I can't make the final assault, but I can hold this position, make sure no reinforcements come up behind you." Kayla looked at the young Marine, seeing the determination in his eyes that she'd witnessed in every human soldier she'd ever treated. "Marcus, you've already done enough." "No, ma'am," he replied, checking the charge on his plasma rifle. "Not until every one of those bastards pays for what they did here." Level 7 was a killing field. The hegemony had concentrated their remaining forces in the approaches to the command center. Over 100 elite guards in powered armor, supported by heavy weapons emplacements and energy barriers that could stop starship-grade weapons. What they faced in return was something that defied every military projection in their databases. Kevdon, his body failing from stimulant overload, led the final Velter charge with the fury of a dying star. His war cry echoed through the corridors as he threw himself against the energy barriers with enough force to overload their generators. The barriers flickered and failed, opening gaps for the assault. The surviving Kitharan fighters swarmed through those gaps like living nightmares, their enhanced reflexes allowing them to dodge point-blank plasma fire while their claws found gaps in powered armor. Their natural ability to secrete acidic compounds had been amplified by Kayla's chemical treatments. They literally dissolved their way through enemy positions. Colonel Blackstone led the human contingent in a flanking maneuver that would have been impossible for unenhanced troops, moving with chemically boosted speed and coordination. They bypassed the main defenses and struck at the command center's power systems. But it was Kayla herself who broke the hegemony's final defense. She'd injected herself with the same combat stimulants she'd given the others, her medical knowledge allowing her to calibrate the dosage for maximum effect with minimal immediate risk. Her hands, trained from microsurgery, now moved with inhuman precision as she systematically disabled the hegemony's command personnel with surgical strikes to nerve clusters and pressure points. "Broadcast everything," she ordered as they secured the command center, her voice eerily calm despite the carnage around them. "Every torture session, every execution, every experiment, send it to every news network, every diplomatic channel, every military frequency in the galaxy." As the data streams began uploading, Kayla looked around at what remained of her revolution. Of the 200 prisoners who joined the uprising, fewer than 40 remained alive. But they'd done something unprecedented. They'd taken a maximum security hegemony detention facility and exposed the systematic atrocities being committed in the shadows. The galaxy would finally see what the hegemony truly was. The emergency broadcasts from detention complex Omega-7 reached 12 systems within the first hour. By the second hour, the recordings of hegemony torture sessions and medical experiments were being transmitted across 47 different news networks. By the third hour, emergency sessions were being called in the Galactic Council while 3 separate species were mobilizing their fleets. Kayla watched the chaos unfold through the command center's monitoring systems while desperately trying to keep her surviving fighters alive. The combat stimulants were wearing off, leaving her people in various stages of metabolic collapse. "Doc," Colonel Blackstone wheezed from her position at the tactical console, "we've got incoming. Multiple hegemony battle cruisers dropping out of hyperspace. They're not here to negotiate." Through the facility's external sensors, Kayla could see the massive warships taking positions in orbit. Each one carried enough firepower to reduce the entire complex to constituent atoms. The hegemony had clearly decided that containing this rebellion was worth destroying the evidence and everyone in it. "How long before they can target us?" she asked while injecting cardiac stabilizers into Kevdon. The Velter warrior was barely conscious, his enhanced metabolism finally shutting down after hours of chemical acceleration. 20 minutes, maybe 30, Blackstone replied. "But Doc, we won. The transmissions got out. The whole galaxy knows." What happened here? Kayla looked around at her dying comrades. 37 beings from 3 species. All that remained of a revolution that had cost hundreds of lives. They'd achieved their objective, expose the hegemony's crimes to galactic scrutiny, but the price would be their existence. I didn't save all of you just to watch you die from orbital bombardment, she said grimly, moving to the facility's main communication array. There has to be another option. The answer came from an unexpected source. The complex's long-range sensors detected new hyperspace signatures, but these weren't hegemony vessels. Ships bearing the markings of the Human Colonial Defense Force, the Velter warrior clans, and the Kitharan Technical Collective were dropping into the system in rapid succession. This is Admiral Sarachan, Human Colonial Defense Force. A voice crackled through the communication systems. We received your transmissions, Dr. Voss. Medical relief and combat support en route to your position. This is War Leader Kefvara of the Velter clans, another voice added. The warriors Kevdon has brought honor to all our people. We come to ensure their sacrifice has meaning. Technical Collective Fleet acknowledges. A third voice chimed in. Medical assistance and engineering support prepared for immediate deployment. Kayla felt something she hadn't experienced in days. Hope. But as she watched the tactical displays, that hope was tempered by reality. The rescue fleets were still hours away from effective engagement range, while the hegemony battle cruisers were already powering their main weapons. All units, the hegemony fleet commander's voice echoed through intercepted communications. Prepare for immediate planetary bombardment. Target the detention facility and a 50-kilometer radius. No survivors. They're going to glass the entire area, Colonel Blackstone observed grimly. Kill us and anyone who might try to rescue us. Kayla's enhanced mind, still partially accelerated by combat stimulants, began processing options with machine-like efficiency. The facility's defense systems were minimal, designed to keep prisoners in, not warships out. The orbital bombardment would begin in minutes, and even if the rescue fleets arrived in time, the battle would reduce the complex to debris, unless, Colonel, she said suddenly, the facility's main reactor. It's a contained fusion system, right? Blackstone's eyes widened with understanding. Doc, if you overload that reactor, the explosion will take out anything within 1,000 kilometers. Kayla finished, including us, but also including those battle cruisers if we can lure them into close orbital position. Kevdon, barely conscious, but still monitoring their conversation, raised his head weakly. Human doctor, you speak of warriors' deaths, good deaths. No, Kayla said firmly, I speak of meaningful deaths. Deaths that ensure the evidence of hegemony crimes survives. That our rescue fleets don't get slaughtered trying to save corpses. And that the galaxy remembers what happened here. She began working on the reactor controls while her surviving fighters took defensive positions. The hegemony had surely detected the incoming rescue fleets by now, and they'd be sending ground forces to prevent any sabotage of their bombardment plans. The first assault came through the main blast door's hegemony. Elite troops in full battle armor, moving with desperate urgency. They'd obviously been ordered to secure the facility's command center before the orbital bombardment commenced. What they found were 37 dying revolutionaries who had nothing left to lose. The battle was brief but savage. Enhanced fighters, with failing metabolisms, threw themselves against fresh troops with suicidal fury. Kitharan warriors, their nervous systems burning out, used their final moments to claw through armor plating. Velter fighters, their hearts giving out from stimulant overload, crushed enemies with death grips that held even after consciousness faded. Human soldiers, their tactical training intact even as their bodies failed, coordinated the defense with mathematical precision. Every shot counted, every position was held to the last breath. Every sacrifice bought precious seconds for Kayla to complete her work on the reactor. Doc, Private Dwight's voice came through the communication system. From his position on level 6, they're sending everything they've got. I can hold them for maybe 2 more minutes. Kayla's fingers flew over the reactor controls, her medical knowledge of energy systems serving her well. The fusion containment fields were responding to her modifications, building toward an unstable cascade that would turn the entire facility into a stellar-class explosion. Hegemony Fleet, this is Dr. Kayla Voss. She broadcasts on all frequencies. You have 2 minutes to withdraw your vessels beyond safe distance, or you'll be caught in the reactor detonation. The response was immediate laughter from the fleet. Commander, human lies. You lack the technical knowledge to breach fusion containment. I'm a doctor, Kayla replied calmly, watching the reactor's output climbing toward critical levels. I understand energy systems better than you understand the beings you've been torturing. Final warning: withdraw or burn with us. The hegemony. Commander's arrogance would be his fleet's doom. The battle cruisers moved into closer orbital position, preparing to begin bombardment before any sabotage could be completed. They just positioned themselves at the exact range Kayla needed. All surviving fighters, she called over the internal communication system. Reactor breach in 90 seconds. It's been an honor serving with you, Colonel Blackstone. Her body finally giving out from her injuries, managed one final salute. Doc, tell them we didn't break. Kevdon, his warrior's heart barely beating, raised his head one last time. Human doctor, you have become true warrior. As the reactor containment began its final collapse, Kayla looked out through the command center's armored windows at the stars beyond. Somewhere out there, the galaxy was receiving proof of hegemony atrocities. The revolution that had started with healing would end with justice. The last thing she saw before the fusion detonation consumed everything was the rescue fleets dropping out of hyperspace, arriving just in time to witness the birth of a new star-where detention complex Omega-7 had once stood. The explosion that consumed detention complex Omega-7 was visible from 3 systems away. When the brilliant flare of uncontrolled fusion finally faded, nothing remained of the facility, the surrounding landscape, or the 4 hegemony battle cruisers that had been caught in the detonation. The rescue fleets found only debris and radiation, where 37 revolutionaries had made their final stand. But Dr. Kayla Voss had achieved something far greater than survival. 6 months after the Omega-7 incident, as historians would later call it, the hegemony's government collapsed under the weight of galactic outrage. The recordings transmitted from the detention complex had revealed systematic torture, illegal medical experimentation, and genocide on a scale that shocked even hardened military observers. Species that had remained neutral in the Rim Wars joined the coalition against hegemony expansion. Admiral Sarah Chen stood before the memorial wall on New Geneva, reading the names carved into black stone. Kayla Voss's name held the place of honor at the center, surrounded by the 36 beings who had died with her in the reactor explosion. But these weren't the only names. Every prisoner who had perished in the revolt was remembered here. Ma'am, her aide approached respectfully. The Velter delegation has arrived for the ceremony. Chen nodded, turning to face the assembled crowd. Representatives from dozens of species had come to witness the dedication of the memorial. But the real significance lay in what it represented. The Omega-7 incident had proven that beings from different species could unite against tyranny. That shared suffering could forge bonds stronger than any political alliance. War leader Kethvara, Kevdana's sister, stepped forward to place a traditional Velter battle spear at the base of the memorial. My brother found his warrior's death, she said in heavily accented standard, but more important, he found warrior's cause. This human doctor. She taught him that healing and fighting are not opposite things. Technical collective, representative, Zethkar, speaking for the Kitharan survivors, added his species' traditional offering of crystalline mathematics complex equations that expressed their understanding of sacrifice and honor. Degmer sent final transmission before death. He chittered, said human doctor taught him that oath to heal includes oath to stop those who cause harm. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. My name is Marcus Dwight, the former Marine private said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. He stood on prosthetic legs, his body bearing the scars of his time in the detention complex. But his bearing was that of a man who had found his purpose. 6 months ago, I was dying in a hegemony prison cell, watching my leg rot from infection. Dr. Voss could have treated just the humans. We were her people, her responsibility. He paused, looking up at Kayla's name on the memorial wall. Instead, she chose to heal everyone. Kitharan, Velter, human, it didn't matter. She saw patients, not enemies. And when the time came to fight, she turned that same moral clarity into something the hegemony couldn't understand or defeat. Dwight reached into his uniform jacket and pulled out a small medical scanner, the same type Kayla had carried during her service in the Colonial Medical Corps. I'm starting medical school next month, he announced. Xenobiology specialty, with a focus on cross-species trauma treatment, because Dr. Voss taught me that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to make sure their deaths mean something to the living. The ceremony concluded with the reading of what became known as the Omega-7 Oath. Transmitted by Kala in her final message before the reactor detonation, we, the beings who stood together in the darkness, swear that no species shall suffer alone. What we have endured together, we pledge that healing shall not be bound by the accidents of birth or the prejudices of governments. We promise that when tyranny rises to crush the innocent, there will always be those who choose to stand, to fight, and if necessary, to die so that others might live in freedom. The oath was adopted by medical schools across 12 species, by military academies in 47 systems, and by the newly formed Galactic Medical Relief Corps, an organization dedicated to providing humanitarian aid regardless of political boundaries or species barriers. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Dr. Kayla Voss came in the form of a small medical clinic on the border between human and Velter space. The staff was mixed species. The patients came from across the galaxy, and above the entrance, carved in a dozen different languages, were the words that had started a revolution. First, do no harm, but never forget that sometimes the greatest harm comes from standing aside while others suffer. The hegemony was gone, scattered to the cosmic winds after their government's collapse. The Rim Wars had ended with the establishment of the Omega Accords, a treaty that guaranteed medical neutrality in conflicts and established universal standards for the treatment of prisoners. Dr. Kayla Voss had set out to heal the wounded and had ended up healing something far greater: the divisions between species that had allowed atrocities like detention complex Omega-7 to exist in shadow. She kept her oath to do no harm. In the end, she'd done it by teaching the galaxy that sometimes the greatest healing requires the greatest sacrifice. The revolution that began with a single act of compassion had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a lasting peace built on the understanding that all sentient life deserved dignity, medical care, and the right to exist without fear. In the end, they hadn't just imprisoned a human medic, they created a martyr whose legacy would outlive empires. And across the galaxy, in medical schools and military academies, in hospitals and relief stations, beings of every species learned the lesson Kayla Voss had died to teach: that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in their weapons or their technology, but in their absolute refusal to accept that suffering was inevitable, that cruelty was natural, or that justice was impossible. They learned why the galaxy called it humanity. Fuck yeah. Not because humans were superior, but because when faced with the choice between comfortable compliance and dangerous compassion, humans consistently chose to fight for something greater than themselves. The memorial stood as eternal testament to that choice and to the 37 beings who had made it together in the darkness of detention complex Omega-7. Their names would be remembered. Their sacrifice would not be forgotten. And somewhere in the galaxy, whenever tyranny rose again, there would always be someone ready to stand up and say, "Not on my watch. Not while I still breathe." The revolution was over. The healing could begin.